So I'd like to just welcome up our panel, and if you could give us a second, I will just kind of give them some brief instructions on any details they need, and then we'll get started. All right, so we're set. Hey, they don't have any slides, so this is cool. This is all discussion. So be ready with your questions. Everybody listen carefully, pay attention, and I will turn it over to Seamus. Take it away.
Good morning. We are which stand between you and lunch. And a good keynote. So we hope to be stimulating in our discussion. Again, we have no slides. We hope this will be an open discussion between the panel, and we hope there'll be enough time that we'll take questions from the audience in this very interesting topic. Just to introduce myself, I'm Seamus Tuohy. I'm with Dynetics. I'm the business development lead for aerospace, defense, and civil down in Huntsville. And on the panel with me, and I'll go through all three of them, and then I'll ask them to provide their own introductions to Magnus, Joe Cassady, and Jared Stout. So why don't we start? Jared, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. And I just realized you asked me to send you my bio. I forgot. So that's not bad.
You're here.
I'm Jared Stout. I currently am the director of Congressional Regulatory Policy for Meeks, Butera, and Israel in DC. My last term of service in the federal government was as Deputy Executive Secretary and Chief of Staff of the National Space Council. And throughout my career, I've spent time on the Hill for the House Science Committee and the FAA's Office of Commercial Space Transportation, where I was the Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief of Staff in that office. And so now I'm just out here in the world helping companies navigate the regulatory and political business of space.
Sandy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Magnus. I am currently an independent aerospace consultant and part-time professor at Georgia Tech. I had two different terms of service in the federal government. I spent 16 years at NASA as an astronaut, and I also served in the Pentagon under Mike Griffin in the Research and Engineering Organization as the chief engineer. In between those two assignments, I led the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics for 5.5 years. And I call what I'm doing now the smorgasbord part of my career. So delighted to be here today.
And Joe.
Hi, I'm Joe Cassady. I'm with Aerojet Rocketdyne, and I've spent pretty much all my career with Aerojet or its legacy companies. Along the way, I've worked on lots of different technologies, flown a bunch of stuff as different payloads, and lately I've been working on a team of industry partners that are looking at taking over the production and operations of the SLS launch vehicle. So I'm going to bring some industry perspectives to that.
So how we thought to kind of break up the session is in three different segments. The first segment is to discuss the national space policy and its embrace, or maybe not, we'll see what the comments are, by the current administration, and what its impacts are to Artemis, or how Artemis can actually impact space policy. Then the second segment to talk about global leadership of the United States in space, in particular in how Artemis can assist in that, or what are the responsibilities for Artemis to do that. And then finally, look at the role of NASA with respect to the space policy in the current environment that we see with Artemis. So just to introduce the first segment, just to remind folks of the national space policy that was put in place in 2020, that there are 5 key elements to it, and I'm going to be very brief, and I apologize if it's not, I don't do it the justice it deserves, is the 5 points are a shared interest of all nations to act responsibly, openness, transparency, predictability. That is critical to U.S. leadership to have a robust, innovative, and competitive commercial space sector. That the U.S. will expand its leadership alongside nations that share democratic values, respect for human rights, and economic freedom. That the US will pursue the extraction and utilization of space resources in compliance with applicable law. And the US will continue to use space for national security activities with the inherent right of self-defense and unfettered access and freedom to operate in a space that is vital to the national interest. So again, the first segment is we've been talking about or discuss how Artemis plays within that. So the first question is to Jared. So I believe you did support the development of the space policy. So the first question is, what are the key elements of the space policy that actually fall to NASA to implement?
Yeah, so I think if we think about national space policy in sort of like three buckets, there's the civil, the commercial, the national security. And we generally think of the civil portion of that being led by NASA. And so the administration, when developing the policy, I think, was really looking for NASA to be sort of the anchor of our instruments of national power associated with the civil portfolio. And when we look at all of the various things that NASA does, whether it's Artemis or it's science or it's space technology or anything like that, we're really seeing those as instruments of national power that we can derive value from and lead the world. And so I think you have to look at space policy for the civil bucket, sort of in that lens. And so Artemis offers us an opportunity to demonstrate leadership, to bring other like-minded nations along with us, and to whether it's going to the moon or it's developing a new way of doing commerce and expanding our economic sphere of influence and that sort of thing. But I think the policies, if you start with the idea that these are all again like instruments of national power and back up from that, and that's probably I think probably the best way to look at NASA's responsibility as part of that.
Okay. For Sandy, Artemis is key to realizing these national objectives for space policy. What are the key aspects of the policy that you think are important for NASA to prioritize when they formulate Artemis?
Right, so one of the important aspects of leadership is setting a vision. And I think that's what NASA is able to do with the Artemis program. It's like, hey, everyone, we're all excited about low Earth orbit, but our vision is to go beyond low Earth orbit. And we think it makes sense, as an operator, I totally agree with this, by the way, to go to the moon first and establish some, that we have our technology down pat, that we have our operations down pat. And our vision is then to go to Mars, and we all think that's a really interesting place. And as we engage in this vision, we also want to make sure that we're creating a vibrant economic system, not only for ourselves clearly, but our industry is definitely grabbing a hold and riding that wagon faster than some of the other systems around the world, but also for everybody. And so in the context of that leadership, who wants to come along? And so I think that was driving the Artemis Accords and how they were constructed. And then as you think about that from a leader viewpoint, I totally appreciate the world power, but if I'm another nation, I'm looking at this going, oh, that's a vision I can get on board with. And then it becomes a matter of what are the standards, what's the infrastructure, how can everyone play a part collaboratively? And that's really what you want to do as a leader. There's a whole other paradigm that can be set that we are not choosing to do as a nation, which is we're going to go do this. And if you want to come on board, we're going to be 100% in this paradigm and nobody else can contribute or add any value or debate. And I don't think we're 1 or 0 on that, but that's really what the leadership here is. And that's what NASA is focused on, and then how they go about it, how they figure out what the norms of behavior are, how they figure out what the infrastructure is, how they figure out what the standards are, how the collaborators who come on board understand where their national interests lie in conjunction with this vision. That's really what's unfolding before us right now. It's very much a work in progress.
So for Joe, from the industry standpoint, do you actually see this as something that is being embraced in national space policy by the administration? And maybe it's unfair because maybe the PDR comes out next week, we might see something there, but I'd like to comment on that.
Sure, yeah, Seamus, I do. I think one of the things going back, many years now, since about 2010 with the, Jared, I think that was the last authorization act, right? 2017, yeah, that's right, they did do that one, but since those two authorization acts, one of the things we've been really stressing to, those who represent us in Congress and others is, in order to really do these big things that Sandy's talking about and to fulfill that policy that Jared was part of putting in place, you have to have constancy of purpose. One of the criticisms of our programs in the past have been that when we had administration changes, we tended to veer off course or completely reverse course. And so what we've seen is the evidence over that decade that we've been working toward our goals of getting back to the moon, that we have had that constancy of purpose. And the evidence of that last week was we just rolled out the Space Launch System and the Orion vehicle that's going to make that trip in about a couple of months now. We're going to go test on the pad in a few weeks and wet dress rehearsal. If that goes well, we'll roll her back into the VAB, do the last checks and get things ready to go, roll it out to the pad, and probably launch in May or June. And we'll have the first time we've been out to the moon with a human-rated vehicle in 50 years. So yeah, we're seeing it.
I just want to add something to that, because I think this is a really underappreciated aspect of anything that an administration does when they come in. So when we first stood up the National Space Council 5.5 years ago now, we started with the basic premise that the Obama administration's national space policy was basically pretty good. Like, there really wasn't a whole lot that we thought needed to be changed. We did make the major change to create Artemis, but outside of that, we really didn't think that most of it needed. There were like nothing that we came in and said, okay, we need to like wipe this away and start over. And there were a lot of folks that sort of early on kind of criticized us for that. Like, there were a lot of there were a lot of folks that didn't like the policy at the time and really wanted to see a lot of changes to it. But we prioritized the constancy of purpose, and we prioritized making sure that the policy that was in place, that all of the agencies have been working towards and working on for so long, that policy, as much as we could keep it intact, we really should, in order to provide that stability across administrations. And so I'm sort of hearing the same thing happen with the Biden administration. People were sort of criticizing and saying, well, the last policy that just came out, it's the Trump policy, you need to change it. And I think much to the Biden administration's credit, I think they've sort of taken the same position that we took when we first came in, which was that constancy of purpose is important. Being able to provide reasonable, stable, transparent policy is important that can last longer than just any particular administration transition. And I really think the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for that, because it's not easy. It's much easier to come in and say, okay, we're going to start over, and we're going to make sure that this policy is exactly ours and what we want it to be. And they haven't done that, and I think that's really important, and they should really be applauded for that, because it's not easy to do, to say like we're going to wait and see how this develops before we make any changes.
So I should have said at the beginning that please hold your questions. We will have a nice Q&A after we get through those 3 segments. I knew that some of the topics we would cover early, might generate a lot of questions. I want to make sure we got through some of the other topics, but we will get, you will have the opportunity to grill the panel for that. So the next part, getting to global leadership. Joe mentioned the exciting rollout of the SAC. Which means that 22 is going to be a very exciting year for Artemis. However, given what's happening in the world, there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly what Russia's role is going to be in future space activities, and there's also the emergence of China as a peer competitor or peer to the United States. So for global leadership, the first question to go back to Jared is, what does U.S. leadership look like, and what are the challenges particular to NASA?
Yeah, so I think U.S. leadership is, to me, is really about bringing together as many countries that are wanting to sign on to our principles of leadership and are interested in being a part of the vision that, as Sandy was describing, the vision that we're building for what future space exploration and future space commerce actually looks like. When we first started working on, for example, Space Policy Directive 2, which was about regulatory reform, and Space Policy Directive 3, which was about space situational awareness and space traffic management, we were sort of starting with the idea that it's okay for other countries to have their own space policies and their own ideas about what national power looks like to them for space policy. But we just don't want them to be out there alone without us. And so when we think about the Artemis Accords and we think about pulling like-minded nations together for the future of exploration of the solar system, I think it's okay for China and Russia to have their own ideas about what that should look like. And if China wants to have a moon program and go land on the moon and have humans on the moon, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If they want to do that, they should go do that. They're their own country and they can do what they want. But I don't think they should be there without us. And I think that when we think about what we want the future of humanity's expansion into the solar system to look like, I think that we want to carry our values into that expansion of the solar system. Things that prioritize democracy and human rights and the types of things that we value in our country today, terrestrially. I think we want to carry those things with us into the future. And so as NASA continues to develop the Artemis Accords and bring partners into the Artemis program with them, every country that we add to the Artemis Accords is another country that can be a part of the future we're trying to build, and in turn we can impart some of those values perhaps with them as well. So that I think that's the main aspect of exploration that the US and Artemis has in its value for our expansion of the solar system.
It goes back to the norms of behavior, but I also think another aspect of leadership is being the energizer bunny and providing the energy into the system to keep the vision, the approach to the vision moving along. And so NASA, in order to do these things, I think NASA needs to be very engaged internationally with potential partners, with our current partners, and understanding, their goals and their desires and how they think they fit in the vision, and trying to weave it all together. I mean, there is that energizer bunny piece where you're constantly putting energy in the system. This constancy of purpose that the agency's had over the last decade, I think helps them work from a more stable platform, because it's hard to go out to your international partners and say, hey, we've got this vision and we want to go do X, when everyone's very well aware that every 4 years we tend to change our minds in the US. That's been very frustrating for our international partners in the past. So I think we are in a really good position to promote the vision, and B, energize the bunny, put the energy into the system to continue building that coalition and figuring out what are those norms of behaviors, what are those intersections of interests, and how can we all work together. And that will, I think, promote a really nice future for us in space. And will there be other paradigms that develop, as Jared mentioned? Yes, and eventually all the different paradigms, maybe 3, 4, whatever, we'll have to figure out how to work together just like we do on the planet. And that's sort of the trajectory that I see.
And I'll just add to that. completely agree with what Sandy said, and definitely if we want to be able to establish those norms of behavior, we've got to be in there as not just a participant, but a leader. And that's where having the vision and then backing up the vision with more than PowerPoint charts. It's great to say, hey, we want to go do this. I'm a Mars guy. I've been watching, we've been 20 years away from Mars from almost my whole career. I think we might be inside the 20-year window now. I'm beginning.
18.
Yes, we're 18. Yes, thank you. So there's some hope. But it is critical to back that up with hardware and actual infrastructure. And that's what I see NASA doing now. Sandy said earlier, we've been in LEO for a long time. We're kind of working our way out of that, and NASA's going to back the way out of operations at LEO and go out and lead the new frontier out to the moon and onto Mars.
So Sandy, along with being the Energizer Bunny on policy, it's also stepping out, and actually doing missions. And NASA's kind of taken a non-traditional approach in how they're doing this. Orion and SLS, follow a traditional acquisition model, but things like CLIPS and HLS have been more, services oriented or like a taxi cab type of approach. Could you comment on, does that pose a risk to what risk is there in acquiring capability that way? How does it play with our international partners and also as it relates to policy?
Yeah, we live in a really interesting time, right? We're all well aware this transition started probably about 15 years ago now, when the decision was made with the retirement of the shuttle to contract for a service for cargo delivery, which then moved into contracting for commercial crew delivery to the space station, and now the toe is being dipped into the lunar program, how we might do that. I kind of look at this as another form of leadership, and is there risk? Yes, and I'll get to that. If you mind, I'll have a little soliloquy here. When I talk to people about this, I kind of picture an expanding bubble, right? With the leading edge of that bubble expanding off of beyond low Earth orbit, that's driven by government missions and government needs, because that leading edge of that bubble is the hard stuff, is the stuff that it's not quite clear where the profit motive is. So it's not quite clear as you chart new territory where industry can make a profit or not make a profit. So that's inherently governmental. So that bubble's been sort of stuck in low Earth orbit for the last several decades. But now that bubble's expanding to the moon. So what's happening behind the leading edge of that bubble? We've got this very interesting paradigm where industry and the government is allowing it, and industry is stating, hey, maybe there's some stuff we can do in space to make a profit that might not be only dependent on government business. So let's explore that. And that's what entrepreneurs do. They take risks and they build new enterprises. And so you see that going on in low Earth orbit, all this conversation about debris removal and private space stations and tourism in space and on-orbit manufacturing or whatever. And so it's interesting that what NASA's doing is they expand to cislunar space, is go, okay, let's acknowledge we have this expanding bubble. Let's acknowledge that we're going to cislunar space. Let's also acknowledge that Mars is really, we want to go. And so, to the Mars people, they're very frustrated about going to the moon because they're afraid we're going to get bogged down in the moon and we're never get to Mars, right? So that's one tribe inside of our space community. And so NASA's kind of going, all right, as we go to cislunar space, let's keep, government mission. We want to know what we need to learn to go to Mars. But now that we know industry is sort of interested in doing stuff in space, even though we're all very clueless on the business case, right? Let's be honest about that. But how can we think about our journey to cislunar space to accomplish the things that we need to do to advance that bubble, which is the government mission, but do it in such a way from the get-go, based on what we're learning about LEO, do it in such a way from the get-go that we incorporate private industry so that there's some sustainable economic activity available at the moon in cislunar space as we continue to Mars. So that's kind of the thought process, I think, behind what we see. Now, is there risk involved? Yes. Or do we have all the answers? No. Like I said, we're 15 years into this transition of how is all this going to work? I personally think we have another 10 or 15 years of sorting through it. And so for the young people coming into the space industry, it's like, oh my goodness, it's really no holds barred for what can happen. The risk, as a crew member, you know, how we manage this risk is really key, and I'm not entirely sure we're on top of that yet. Because we have fundamentally as a community, a lot of strong foundational knowledge, both technical and operational, about how to operate in low Earth orbit. We haven't gone back to the moon in 50 years. There are different operational and safety challenges. And so, you know, that balance of how you insert industry and contract as a service, if you will, where NASA doesn't have control of the design nor insight into the engineering trades that went into the design, you know, and what that risk is. I think we're still learning a little bit about that, but it's an amazing journey that we're on. I think, you know, when you talk about leadership, this is another area where we're leading, and how we do this, you know, other nations around the world are looking at what we're doing, and they're gonna learn from our mistakes. They're gonna learn for what goes well, and it is setting a little bit of the paradigm as we move as a species into the future. So sorry for the long answer, but
No.
I'm very enthusiastic about all this.
I actually, and I think that this is another area where it's as we think of the space program as an instrument of national power, we can also think of the special sauce of the United States being our entrepreneurial system. It's not really something anybody else around the world has been able to replicate in the same way. And I think, you know, when you look at how the Chinese and the Russians talk about the US space industry at international forums like the UN Compass and other international fora, you can see they're clearly very frustrated and we can see it in the way where Gozan is talking about SpaceX on a regular basis. They're very frustrated that we have this vibrant entrepreneurial commercial space sector that's doing all of this stuff. And I think they're very frustrated that they haven't, either they can't or won't recreate it. So I think to Sandy's point, when we look at, you know, sort of what the future looks like, and we think about the international treaties that sort of govern these things, and how the US, as far back as the 60s, when the Outer Space Treaty was signed, we were very clear back then that there were different rules for government than there are for commercial actors, and that those commercial actors were free to do lots of things that governments were not free to do under the agreement. And I think that has been a source of tremendous frustration for other countries. But it is one of those elements of leadership that makes, I think, the US, puts the US in a special position.
So Joe, with this non-traditional approach, a lot of pressure is being put on what I would call the traditional industrial base, you know, to lower costs and get more efficient. Could you comment on what you see in the industry to try to achieve those goals?
Yeah, we've noticed, I'll say that, and we are paying attention to that. I think what you would find, and I'll use an example here in a minute, is that most of us are keenly aware of the need to, you know, do things at, I'll say, an appropriate level of affordability. And I come back to something Sandy said, consistent with reliability and safety, because when there are crews involved, you know, that has to come first. And those of us who've been involved going back to the Mercury Gemini days, through Apollo and through the shuttle, you know, that's something that has been burned into our brains. And I have a picture on my desk of the Apollo 1 crew. And when I look at that every day, I realize the responsibility I have, you know, in everything I do, and that goes through our company. So, you know, we're always going to take that responsibility very seriously, but we are looking at ways to do things better. One of the examples that I was going to give you was this Tiger team that I've been involved in recently. And about 6 months ago, I guess now, NASA came out with an RFI, and they said, you know, we're getting the SLS through its development period. We want to produce and operate it in the most efficient way we can. And we want to look at new ideas for how to do that. So through it open to industry, come back and tell us how you would do that. So we formed a team, And it's many of the companies that you've heard of, including ours, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Jacobs. And we all teamed up together and put together a response to that RFI. And in that, we identified lots of areas where we could produce and operate that system in a more efficient manner and meet some of those goals. And one of those goals is sustainability, because we want to operate this over the next 30 years. And so I think what you'd find is, going back to what I started off with, yes, we take it very seriously. We also take the responsibility to do things in a safe manner and not to ignore the recommendations of things like the cave and things like that. And we're putting those together and coming up with what we think is going to be a very effective system that will keep us in the forefront of the capabilities that we're going to need for the civil program, as well as potentially for the national security space program in the coming years. As that sphere, just like Sandy was describing the bubble for the exploration, that sphere is also moving out toward the moon and cislunar space, as we see more activities from some of these peer nations like China.
And let's be clear here, right? I mean, the traditional companies have grown up working as government contractors for NASA. So they've had to impedance match, if you will, the bureaucracy that being a government contractor comes with it. So one of the things that traditional companies have to learn is as they're acquiring acquisition contracts that are for a service, they have to kind of delete that bureaucracy. But NASA on its side, has certain ideas in its head about how they work with certain contractors, and they have to reform on their side, or the traditional companies are kind of stuck. So there's a whole culture change that has to happen on both sides in this new mode for the traditional companies. Now, what NASA has to figure out too is, if I'm gonna contract in a traditional acquisition model, and there are good reasons for doing it, from a safety viewpoint, because I have more insight. I want to help design the car, and I want to understand in the bowels of how the car is being built, because I'm going to own and operate the car. That's going to come with more overhead, and that's going to be more expensive, right? There's a price for that. If you're contracting as a service, well, okay, the car shows up, and you're just going to get in the car and drive it. That doesn't have as much overhead, but you also don't have much insight. Now, the interesting thing where we are in the space program, especially in manned space flight or crewed space flight, whatever, if I go buy a car, if I go buy a Chevrolet or a Toyota or whatever, that I know as a consumer that car comes with a lot of safety features that have been driven by regulations that have been learned in the Department of Transportation over decades. So I don't have to question, well, is Ford more safe than, there's, second, third order stuff there, but there's a general umbrella that covers, regulations that covers that car. Right now in the space industry, we don't have that. And so this risk reward, cost versus safety thing, we're all still trying to figure out. And so I don't know if I'm buying a car from company X or company Y or company Z as a service, what are the regulations as a consumer that keeps us safe? NASA's working on that, right? They've got human spaceflight certification guidelines that they're enforcing, but we're still trying to figure out what that regime looks like. So this whole idea of who's doing what cheaper for what service or contract, you really got to dig into the bowels of the acquisition process. You got to understand the culture. And then, NASA as a government agency has a certain amount of overhead that it has to pay for. And how it spreads that overhead is, I have no clue, but that's a factor in here. So some of these conversations that happen publicly about the cost of this or the cost of that, they're very, I don't want to say misleading, but they don't really get into some of these details that are driving some of the real dynamics that are happening, behind the scenes. And then of course there's all the political agendas and who's trying to position what where. I get all that. But to me, as a crew member, I'm looking at this going, where's the risk reward? How are we managing safety? Let's discuss, the costs and the context of that. Let's discuss what's the acquisition approach that we should be taking for different toys that we're building to go further in space from that viewpoint and really understand this. And we're all in learning mode. we're gonna be for a while, and I think we just need to all take this into account when we're having these conversations and be aware of these depths to these conversations and not, just kind of throw stones, at the most obvious piece parts, because at the end of the day, the crew safety and human safety and risk management is at the baseline of all of these conversations.
Stop trying to be so reasonable.
I do this, it's sad.
Logic will not serve you well here.
I think it's all great, by the way, and I love all the innovation going on in the industry, I wanna see it continue. But we have to take some of these deeper level considerations into our, our strategic thinking as we're thinking about how we're gonna continue to move forward, and where is it that the appropriate acquisition methodology, for the different piece parts.
I love the car analogy though.
No,
It's
it's
like
true.
as a former regulator, and I'm a total regulations nerd, so I like the analogy because the regulatory system that we utilize in this country for human spaceflight, commercial human spaceflight, is very unique in respect to sort of like how we would regulate cars or stuff like that. So when you think about like when the federal government goes to buy a bunch of trucks for something, the trucks that they're buying from Ford or GM or whatever, like they're not special trucks. You don't buy like the federal government doesn't buy a special truck when it goes to get whatever vehicles it needs. I mean, DoD does, but like generally speaking, like if you're just like if the Department of Labor needs a truck, they're not gonna, they're not asking for a special truck from GM or Ford. But that is because we have a Department of Transportation and a National Highway Transportation Safety Administration that regulates these things very heavily, and we know what it means because they're all common carriage vehicles, and you ought to be able to go to a car lot and pick up a car and know that that car is going to have a very basic level of safety. We don't really do that in commercial human spaceflight. We do have regulations for third-party safety, and we have regulations for making sure that the public is safe and that sort of thing. But we're very much in the learning process right now of trying to figure out how commercial human spaceflight can operate safely. And we've been talking about this for almost 2 decades now, and it's just now getting to the point where commercial human spaceflight is a thing. And so as the companies they have paying customers and they're taking people to suborbital, and we have these operations happening. I think we're going to learn a lot in the next few years. And I think those lessons that we're learning, and as SpaceX is taking AX-1, is getting ready to go up to the International Space Station. They've already had their first private space for their first astronaut mission. I think all of those things, we're going to learn a lot from that. And I think those lessons learned are going to be able to be infused into systems that hopefully one day NASA will expect a basic level of safety that it just knows these providers are going to have with them. And then perhaps this insight and oversight issue will start to settle down a bit.
Yeah, I was just going to jump on that real quick and say 2 things. One is I agree with the conversation here, and I think we'll see a bit of a leveling, amongst different things. It's somewhat, akin to, people have made this analogy before, the days before there was really scheduled airline services, when airplanes had been around for a while and people were starting to fly as passengers, not just mail trips and things like that. So, we're about at that point. And then the other thing I was going to say is in our response to NASA, one of the things we included was a graph that shows risk coming down, dollars on this scale, risk on this scale, risk comes down, and you're spending more dollars, and then it starts to flatten out, and you're spending a lot more dollars, not really getting that much less risk. And that's the thing that we're trying to do, is move back to the appropriate point on that curve. Exactly what Sandy.
Yeah, that curve, the sweet spot in that curve is where we all want to be, and that's the point we're going to oscillate over for a while until we figure out what it is.
This is great, because it leads me right to the last segment, which is we talked about a different model of safety and regulatory impact and insight. What is the appropriate role for NASA, in particular for Artemis, as they engage upon this? And the first was to Sandy. There was the 2021 annual report of ASAP really hit on this, of hey NASA, if this is the way you're going to go, you know, you need to start making decisions about what you're gonna do. Would you care to comment on any, has NASA responded to that, or do you have
Yeah.
feedback on that?
So number one, NASA is not a regulatory agency, nor should it ever be a regulatory agency. So let's just get that right out there. That is not their function. You know, they have a government mission to explore, to advance technology, and one could argue do that in such a way that helps the space economy prosper. That's kind of a recent ad, although I don't think they actually added it into their mission yet, but that's how they're acting, right? So our point on the ASAP report was, you know, again, we're 15 years into this transition, and NASA's been incrementally, you know, stepping their toe in this water, and our point was like, hey, you know what? You guys have been sort of tactically acting on this idea in this learning mode of how to engage the private industry in a new way to achieve government missions. So really we're at the point as we go into the cislunar space that you need to think about this more strategically from the top down, and not just, you know, I don't want to say ad hoc, but at a tactical program by program level, but really, you know, comprehensively. You know, if the goal is you're going to cislunar space and you're gonna learn what you need to do there to go to Mars, and you wanna, you know, act on this extra part of your mission, which is encouraging the space economy and leading some sustainable efforts behind the cislunar space. You know, think strategically about what aspects of your activities, what aspects of the hardware, what aspects of the capabilities that you are developing to do your government mission make sense from the viewpoint of safety and risk management, the business case for the leveraging the taxpayers' money into the private industry for sustaining a capability that can then, you know, leapfrog into this economy. So think about that more strategically. Don't just say, oh, we're going to contract for a service because, you know, that's way cool. You know, you want to think carefully about the whole ecosystem, because what at the end of the day, you know, NASA has to integrate all these different piece parts into a mission. You know, you've got the SLS, you've got the Orion, you've got the gateway, there's logistics, there's the lander, eventually there's something that's transport on the ground, there's power infrastructure, there's communication infrastructure. That's a lot of stuff that has to be integrated in across a decade or more to achieve missions that advance the government's goals. And there's risk associated in all those piece parts, and there's integrated risk associated with adding that all together. And so you really need to think strategically with all of these variables I've already discussed about how you're gonna manage that risk. And that was really the point of the ASAP report. Now, have they responded? They get it. I mean, the current leadership gets it, right? And you know, NASA's a big monster ship, and trying to steer a ship that big is complicated. And so, you know, there's a lot of conversations going on about how to take those first steps. I remember when I was at AIAA, and we were trying to change the governance. For those of you who are aware, you know, we changed the Constitution and the board while I was there. You know, that was a 3.5-year effort to, you know, we didn't spin on a dime. We kind of did this nice, I don't even say graceful. We did this nice arc, you know, just to get the governance changed. And that organization is still continuing in that turn as to act on the governance change that we did. So moving an organization like NASA around a bend like that is going to take time. But I think the current organization, the leaders get it and are working.
You have to really give them credit though, because it's pretty remarkable in my mind at how much of a culture change has happened in the period of time that has happened. I mean, going from in 2008, in 2008 when we really started to see commercial cargo, and then commercial crew, and then we started talking about doing the commercial LEO development program. Like it's a massive sea change culturally for NASA. And you really have to give them credit for changing so much. And you know, for all that NASA has changed, there's a lot, of course, that still remains the same. You know? even in those programs, like even in cargo and crew, you can see old NASA is still there and alive and well. But you really, I think you have to give them a lot of credit, and for that matter, you gotta give Congress a lot of credit for being willing to endorse a lot of those like cultural changes too, because that was not an easy process either.
So let me real quick, sorry, I mean, something you said, there's, old NASA's not bad, right? New NASA's not better, but strategically, if I'm, thinking about how, again, back to ASAP, right? Thinking about how strategically the organization wants to handle their approach to cislunar, it's really important to be clear to the NASA community what their role is and what they're, and have clear lines about who's responsible for what, so that the right decisions are getting made at the right level for the right reason. Because again, tactically, you've got groups of NASA that are used to working in a certain paradigm and have an understanding that they have certain authorities and that they have certain responsibilities. And then you've got another group that's, working in a different paradigm and they have different authorities and different decisions that they're supposed to make. So from the top down, strategically, you want to make sure everybody understands what their role is, what the authorities are, who's making what decisions, because going back to safety, that's what you need to have, that clear accountability. And so the clarity to the NASA workforce is really vital, regardless of what way NASA chooses to move. The clarity to the NASA workforce about what's expected from them, what kind of decisions they're making, who's got what accountability is really, really important as they go into the cislunar space. Again, regardless of the acquisition methodology or who builds what widget or what country does what, that clarity that comes with a good, well thought out strategy, and that's really critical.
And I'll just add to that, I think the way we see it from an industry standpoint is NASA does have a really important role. You don't want the government to abdicate their responsibility to bring this all together. This is Sandy said, there's a lot of pieces that have to come together. And ultimately, at the root of all that is probability of mission success and safety. And so if you go through and you look at all the things that have to happen in a particular architecture and you add those up, and each one of those has a piece of S of, let's say, 0.98, when you multiply out a number of those over this big massive thing that's going on out there in cislunar space or going to Mars, then you get down to your actual risk, and that is sometimes too low and not acceptable. And that's where NASA has to be able to come in and take the reins and say, this is how we're going to architect this. This is how this should go together. And, then go do whatever they want to do, buy a service or buy a vehicle, whatever it makes sense, get an international partner to supply it. But I don't see NASA becoming a procurement agency either. They're not a regulatory agency. They shouldn't just be buyers of services. So that's kind of where I leave that. And then the other piece I wanted to bring in was things like infrastructure and the leadership in that way to make some of these business ideas possible. And, in terms of ROIs and killer apps, okay, maybe in LEO right now, people have some pretty good ideas. You go out to the moon, drops off quite a bit more, still a lot of uncertainty about whether there's really any there. You go to Mars, zip, there's nothing, there's no ROI there. So what you need NASA and the government to be leaders in terms of what are some of the critical technologies. We heard a question earlier today from a young woman about power. Okay, NASA's going to lead right now. Their SDMD's got a procurement out right now on fission surface power. We're going to need fission surface power for Mars. If you don't believe that, look at the InSight solar arrays. We've lost spacecraft to dust storms on Mars. And so that's a key technology. If you want to do in situ resource utilization, if you want to make those resources, go look up, do a little research and figure out how much power you're going to need to make just enough to get you home. And that's the kind of stuff that power enables. So that's another area where the government has to be there to provide some of that fundamental infrastructure that will enable the entrepreneurs to come along and take advantage.
So when is AJ developing windshield wipers for the solar array?
That's what you would believe how often that question comes up.
I don't understand why that hasn't happened yet. That's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah.
Go fast enough.
We did something different. We did the MMRTGs, so we don't need solar.
So we have some time left, and I'd like to open up for any questions from the audience.
And we have some microphone runners here, so what we'll do is we'll grab 2 of them from you guys, so you'll have to share the other 2. And anybody have any questions? Anyone? We have one up there, one over there. Let's start over.
Thank you all. So as we're trying to enable more and more different entities with different objectives and priorities to get into space, is there any talk of how to prevent a tragedy of commons situation, like what we have with the orbital debris problem in LEO, or damaging some science opportunities that are found on the moon and Mars? Is there any talk of how we can control that using policies and consequences for industry or other governments, things like that?
So I'm gonna put an asterisk by this and say that I'm not sure that I think the orbital debris problem is a tragedy of the commons. I think it's an abdication of responsibility by the United States government to do what it should have been doing all along. You know, like I think industry obviously has a role in this, and there's, you know, like the industry obviously, you know, could have done a better job probably of trying to control orbital debris proliferation. But and you know, I'm sort of on a soapbox on this because I'm personally invested in it. That this is, I really think that the US government has we've let ourselves down, we've let the world down. Like, we should have done a much better job leading on this. And I think that we're still at a point in this where we can fix it. I don't think that we're past the point where you know, it's just completely unfixable and we got to figure out something else. But we need to act right now, and I'm sure, you know, Sandy will have something to add to this because ASAP has talked a lot about this problem and the risk that it poses to human spaceflight, and I think that if we don't act, if we don't do what needs to happen to ensure that we can, you know, mitigate the effects of debris and actively start removing debris and lead the world in doing that, we are going to find ourselves in the situation that I think you're describing, where there will be impacts to science missions, and it will be difficult for us to sort of turn that back. So, you know, if I had to say, like, what's the next step that has to happen, is that Congress has got to make some decisions about who's in charge, who's going to lead it, and who's going to actively be removing that debris. And as of yet, that hasn't really happened. Before I came up here, I actually got a notice that the House Science, Space and Technology Committee is doing a hearing next week on space situational awareness. I am very hopeful that this will be the start of the conversation that needs to happen. But Congress has really got to act here.
It's inexcusable that we have not had any action on this. Inexcusable from a safety viewpoint, from a leadership viewpoint, and it's just irresponsible. And we still don't have the government belly button for our responsibilities to the Outer Space Treaty for mission authorization. So you look at the Inspiration 4 mission that flew, I don't know, whenever it flew, there was no government, US government authoritative, you know, I don't know if that's right now, approver.
Yeah, there wasn't an authorization for what they do on orbit.
Yeah, so we have been, I mean, talk about a lack of leadership. It's so irritating to me. That we cannot act on this. We need clear direction. Industry cannot lead here. Industry, we've tried to get industry together to talk about some of these issues, and I'm not blaming them, because they all have their own agendas and they're trying to push their own ideas, because that's what, I mean, their job is to figure out new business and make profit. So until we have somebody who can guide and lead that conversation and set the box around which we're gonna move forward, this is gonna continue to be really irritating. So As far as the lunar science and things like that, I think NASA's doing a really good job of getting the scientist community, talking to the human spaceflight community, to try and make sure that those missions are integrated to the maximum extent possible. So hopefully, you know, right out of the box, will be a little bit more integrated as opposed to what's going on in the world.
And I should say, in fairness to Congress, the Senate does have a bill that has passed multiple times to answer some of these questions, and the House just hasn't acted on it, so.
Yeah, but still, it's 2022.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's not late, I'm just saying, like, the Senate, in fairness, the Senate has done something.
And at the risk of being one of those people pushing agendas and trying to make money, there's a lot of technology that's been developed in the past 15 years or so that could really address quite a bit of this issue, you know, and it's just not being implemented, it's not being acted on because of the application that Jared referred to. And, you know, it is time that we step it up and insist that some of these things get applied. They're not even new anymore. I mean, you know, in fairness, they're being implemented on Starlink and on OneWeb now, which they chose to do on their own. But it's very simple to put propulsion on satellites to deorbit them and get them out of the way. So it shouldn't be something that we let people skate by on.
We have one up over there. Question.
All right, thank you. Really appreciate all the comments from the panel. First, a very brief comment that it's notable that the Act of 58, NASA Act of 58, actually calls for NASA to the maximum extent possible to facilitate the commercial use of space. So it's really foundational. In fact, there's another clause that calls on NASA to optimize the use of commercial space for other federal agencies. In that context. Question relative to safety, appreciating that last year a Space Safety Institute was established to support all agencies across and commercial players across the space enterprise. What would your recommendations be for key things that a Space Safety Institute could do as a learning organization to help move again, best practices for safety forward as efficiently as possible?
So I think part of this is based in competitive advantage. So when we passed the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015, there were several mechanisms in place to sort of prod the industry towards developing common standards and common industry practices and best practices in order to create industry standards that the FAA and other government agencies could point to and say, if you utilize this standard for this thing, then we consider you've met the safety regulations. It's been a very slow going process. The Commercial Spaceflight Federation and some other folks have tried to sort of bring industry together for the development of best practices and industry standards and that sort of thing. And it's just been a slow process. It's just been a very slow process. And I think a lot of that is because, there's some companies I think see their safety record and the safety features that they offer in their vehicles to be a competitive advantage over others. Sort of the same way that we saw, companies fighting earlier last year, we saw companies fighting over who really was going to space and who wasn't going to space. I think these companies, they see competitive advantages in some of these things, and so they don't really want to share with each other, what types of things they're learning or what types of things they think would be a good standard, because they want to have that standard. They want to own it. They want it to be theirs. I think probably the best thing that we could do in this regard is for like a Space Safety Institute or some similarly situated organization to put together performance standards, performance metrics for how you expect certain vehicles to operate or what you expect certain systems to do, as opposed to trying to be specific about how many times you turn the bolt.
So along those lines, if you look at what the FAA has as their proposed recommended guidelines, what they did, this is back when George Neal was still running the FAA, They took NASA's human, NASA has bazillions of human spaceflight standards and everything they've learned over the years, right? So there was a group at the FAA that, 5, 6, whatever years ago, looked at that and said, okay, this is too much. So they put them into, the proposed FAA human spaceflight recommended guidelines, whatever, I don't know what the right nouns are. But from that there's a list, right? And you can go, and we did this while I was at AIAA, we took that list. We're like, okay, so this is what the FAA quote regulations are gonna be based on, these recommended practices. How would you enforce them, or what would this look like? And so, the problem I have when people jump into standards is standards are an answer to a problem you're trying to solve, right? And so you have to go back up to the big picture. What is the problem you're trying to solve? And so if you go look at the guidelines, you can break those into, okay, this exists already as a best practice, or this is actually something you would prove by the way you designed your vehicle. It's not a standard. Or actually, this is a standard that maybe everybody could benefit from. So I think, having that kind of a matrix to work from will really hone in on what are the right standards that we should be going after. Not let's just create standards to show that we have standards and now the world's a happy place. It really is, what should you start with? And so I think FAA's this work that George and those guys did back, again, 5 or 6 years ago is a good starting point for our conversation, which we should be having soon, because isn't the moratorium end 2023, right? And so just willy-nilly creating standards without a context is not helpful, right? And so
And
take a look at those.
The moratorium we're referring to, for those that may not be aware, is the FAA is prohibited by Congress from regulating spaceflight participants' safety inside a vehicle. So they can't tell you design features or anything. So for example, when Boeing is building an airplane, the FAA tells them how many inches each seat has to be, and how many times they have to turn every single bolt on every single feature, and like all that sort of stuff. The FAA is prohibited from doing that for commercial human spaceflight. So that moratorium, though, is set to expire in 2023, and it's sort of unclear what's going to happen. Congress could extend the moratorium. Congress could do some sort of hybrid something where they allow the FAA to do some sort of regulation. There's like a lot of different options, and the moratorium has been in place sort of since the advent of the commercial human spaceflight industry, and so nobody really knows what's going to be the next steps.
All right, so we have one more question. Your question and your responses, all that's standing between us and lunch. So quick question, quick answers. Go.
Thank you. So my question is just mostly, you mentioned the United States being a leader when someone else asked a question about space debris. You mentioned the United States being a leader in kind of removing or kind of incent or talking about deorbiting and stuff. How do you can incentivize the removal of current space debris that we can't necessarily deorbit easily as a leader to the rest of the world?
So per the Outer Space Treaty, he who launches the stuff owns the stuff, right? So that's the first problem, is that if there are rocket bodies floating around, if talk to at 800 kilometers or wherever, you have to get permission from that nation state to go touch their stuff and move it. So first there's a policy question, which Scott actually had a really good suggestion, which is at the Outer Space Registry, you just check a little box and says, I don't mind if someone takes my stuff, but then, I'm also relieved of liability for what happens when you move my stuff, right? So there's a policy issue there. Then there's a technical issue, which these are big, massive entities that are tumbling unknowingly, perhaps in 3 axes, and how are you going to control that? So, by the way, I would argue that we are not taking any leadership here. So I challenge your premise, but I think those are 2 issues right away, and I'll pause.
And those are both absolutely right on. And the other thing is, part of this is just the first step in solving any problem is knowing admitting you have a problem and knowing what that problem is and characterizing it. And there is now a list of the top 50, I think was published in an IAC paper a couple of years ago. Darren McKnight, yes, is the principal author. And we have a TC that we're working on the same problem. Darren's one of the co-chairs of, I'm part of. And I was going to say, so we've characterized what are the top things we ought to go get rid of. And then it's a problem of, as Sandy said, the technology to do that. And there are a number of private companies that have made some real strides in that area. And I think, you know, at some point, what it comes down to is somebody's got to step up and say, you know, if we can get that box checked off and they don't mind us going and doing it, then somebody's got to say, let's go fund that mission, get that out of there. Because otherwise, if we allow it to happen, you know, where we have some of these collisions of these massive bodies, you know, we're going to be in bad shape for quite a while. So it's, you know, problem is, as humans, we tend to react after the crisis, you know, after the hurricane comes through or after, you know, whatever the disaster is. You can't allow it to happen in space. We've got to be more proactive.
All right. Seamus, anything to close?
No, just to close, I just want to tell Joe, Sandy, Jared, I thought it was a great conversation. I learned a lot today. I learned some things. So thank you for that.
Yes.